The year is 1928. In a small cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returns from a vacation to find something extraordinary. A petri dish, left uncovered, has been contaminated by a mold, Penicillium notatum. Around the mold, he notices a clear ring where bacteria have failed to grow. This accidental discovery, as we know, led to the isolation of penicillin, the world's first true antibiotic, ushering in the age of modern medicine and saving countless lives. But what if this serendipitous moment never happened? Imagine, Fleming's lab was perfectly tidy. The mold never appeared. Or perhaps he simply dismissed it as mere contamination, wiping it away without a second thought. The critical observation is never made. The world, unknowingly, misses its greatest medical breakthrough. Welcome to What If? Today, we're plunging into a terrifying reality where humanity never discovered its most potent weapon against infection: a world without antibiotics. The immediate impact of this absence would be devastating. Without antibiotics, the leading causes of death in the mid-20th century and beyond would remain infectious diseases. Imagine a world where a miner's profession becomes lethally dangerous, not from cave-ins, but from the smallest cut that rapidly escalates into gangrene. Or where a common cold in a kindergarten could decimate an entire village, much like the plague of the Middle Ages. Common infections like strep throat, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and even a simple cut could still be death sentences. Childbirth, once a perilous journey in the pre-antibiotic era, would remain incredibly risky for both mother and child due to puerperal fever, the chilling specter of infection ever present. This wasn't just a risk, it was a pervasive fear that shadowed every pregnancy. The joy of new life would always be tempered by the very real possibility of a swift, agonizing end for both mother and infant. Surgery, as we know it, would be far more perilous or even impossible for complex procedures. Post-operative infections would run rampant, turning life-saving operations into potentially fatal events. Think of a seemingly routine appendectomy, a procedure that in our world is relatively safe, becoming a roll of the dice where the odds are stacked against survival. Organ transplants? Forget about it. The immune suppression required would leave patients utterly vulnerable to every opportunistic bacterium. Even minor procedures, like a broken bone piercing the skin, would carry the terrifying risk of lethal infection. The very concept of a modern hospital, a beacon of healing, would be fundamentally different. Less a place of aggressive intervention and more a facility for isolation, palliative care, and the management of inevitable decline. City architecture itself might evolve to include quarantine rooms or separate entrances for the ill, a chilling testament to constant fear. Public transport, schools, and workplaces would be redesigned with maximum ventilation and minimal contact, resembling sterile, almost prison-like environments. Life expectancy, which soared in the 20th century largely due to antibiotics and vaccines, would likely plateau much earlier, barely surpassing the averages of the late 19th or early 20th century. Many would succumb to infections in childhood or early adulthood. Think of families constantly grieving, entire generations thinned by diseases we now consider minor nuisances. Epidemics would be more frequent and deadlier. With no effective treatment for bacterial diseases, the fear of contagion would be an ever-present, suffocating shadow over daily life, a constant, unseen adversary. You might smell the pervasive scent of disinfectants in public spaces, hear the constant coughs and sneezes, and see more people wearing masks, not as a choice, but out of grim necessity. Societies would adapt, but at a tremendous cost. Public health measures would become incredibly stringent, focusing on sanitation, quarantine, and prevention to an extreme degree. Hand washing, already important, would evolve into a ritualistic, life or death practice, enforced by public campaigns bordering on religious fervor. Homes and workplaces would be designed with infection control as a primary concern, perhaps featuring easily sanitized surfaces, air filtration systems, and strict protocols for entry and exit. The medical profession would focus more on diagnosis and supportive care, with severely limited options for intervention. Doctors would be diagnosticians and comforters, not miracle workers. In this world, heroes might not be pioneering medical researchers, but rather zealous adherents of hygiene, forming almost religious cults around cleanliness. Imagine communities led by hygiene priests or sanitation elders, whose word on cleanliness is law. Or conversely, charlatans might emerge, promising miracle cures, peddling useless concoctions and elixirs to desperate populations, preying on their despair and lack of scientific understanding. The black market for unproven remedies would boom, leading to countless additional tragedies. The geopolitical landscape could also be profoundly affected. Wars would be even more brutal, with simple wound infections claiming more soldiers than the battles themselves. The massive casualties from disease in the trenches, so evident in World War I, would continue to plague future conflicts. Military strategies would shift dramatically. Maintaining troop health would become as critical as firepower, leading to fortified, sanitized encampments and strict quarantines for new recruits. The development of nations could be severely hampered by chronic health crises and high mortality rates, diverting precious resources from economic development or technological progress. Resource allocation would heavily favor public health infrastructure, potentially at the expense of education, arts, or industry. Culture, too, would reflect this pervasive threat. In children's tales, the main monsters might not be dragons, but invisible microbes, and lullabies might not sing of sweet dreams, but of the absolute necessity of washing hands. Literature and art could see new genres dedicated to the relentless struggle against disease, or myths emerging about these unseen enemies. Perhaps a new pantheon of gods or spirits would emerge, representing health, contagion, and purification. The constant fear of death from a trivial ailment and the inherent distrust of others due to the risk of infection would undoubtedly reshape human psychology, leading to a more isolated, less trusting society. Large gatherings might become rare, replaced by smaller, carefully managed interactions. The very concept of touch, of physical closeness, might be viewed with heightened apprehension. Let's go beyond general statements and paint a vivid picture of how specific, now trivial bacterial infections morph into terrifying threats. Pneumonia, the silent killer. This wouldn't just be a serious illness, it would be a leading cause of death across all age groups. Imagine entire wings of hospitals dedicated solely to pneumonia patients, their labored breathing a constant, chilling symphony. What social rituals would emerge around the dying? Would families hold vigils, knowing little could be done? How would this affect the elderly, for whom a simple cold could swiftly descend into fatal lung infection? We'd see a world where catching a chill could genuinely mean a death sentence. Tuberculosis's relentless march. In our timeline, antibiotics largely brought TB under control. In this alternate reality, it would likely remain a pervasive, chronic, and highly contagious disease, slowly wasting away its victims. Sanatoriums, once fading relics, would be central institutions, perhaps even segregated communities, filled with people hoping to wrest their way to recovery, a futile endeavor for many. The cough, a common sound, would carry a terrifying stigma. How would public transport and shared spaces adapt to the constant threat of airborne infection? Could there be designated coughing cars on trains or separate, highly ventilated sections in theaters? Skin infections and amputation. Any break in the skin, a scratch, a burn, an insect bite would be fraught with danger. Staphylococcal and streptococcal infections, now easily treated, would frequently lead to sepsis, gangrene, and the need for amputation to save a life. This would leave a visible scar on society, with many more individuals living with disfigurement or prosthetics, serving as grim reminders of the world's vulnerability. Imagine battlefield medicine where amputation is the primary cure for almost any significant wound, leaving vast numbers of veterans forever marked by their service. Even a child's scraped knee on a playground, now a minor inconvenience, could necessitate weeks of careful wound dressing and fear, or even lead to the loss of a limb. The dental nightmare. Simple tooth decay, if it led to an abscess, could easily become a fatal infection spreading to the brain. Dentistry would be a much more brutal practice, focused on extraction rather than repair, with inherent high risks. People would live with chronic pain or fear simple toothaches more than heart disease. The sight of someone with severe dental decay might evoke not pity, but fear of contagion, or recognition of their precarious health. Oral hygiene would become an obsessive daily ritual, potentially involving harsh, irritating chemicals. The constant threat would fundamentally alter how we live, build, and interact. The sanity of space, architectural adaptation. Beyond quarantine rooms, imagine entire cities redesigned. Buildings might feature multiple segregated ventilation systems, airlocks at entrances, and surfaces made exclusively from easily sanitized materials like polished metal, glass, and specialized ceramics. Public restrooms would be highly automated and constantly disinfected, possibly with timed entry systems to allow for post-use sterilization. Homes might have dedicated decontamination zones upon entry, where shoes are removed, outer garments disinfected, and hands meticulously washed. The aesthetic would be starkly utilitarian, prioritizing sterility over comfort or beauty, favoring minimalist designs that leave no crevices for microbes to hide. Even furniture would be designed for easy wipe down, perhaps upholstered in smooth, impermeable fabrics. Water and waste, the ultimate public health battle. Access to clean, potable water would be even more paramount. Municipal water treatment would be incredibly advanced and heavily monitored, perhaps incorporating novel filtration methods or even constant UV irradiation. Waste disposal systems would be engineered with extreme precision to prevent any leakage or contamination, featuring complex underground networks or even individual household incinerators for biomedical waste. Sanitation workers would be lauded as frontline heroes, their profession elevated to one of critical societal importance, often wearing specialized protective gear and adhering to rigorous protocols. Disease outbreaks tied to contaminated water or waste would be catastrophic. The daily ritual of survival. Every morning might begin with a rigorous personal hygiene regimen, followed by the careful donning of specific clothing designed for minimal microbial retention, perhaps made of easily washable, non-absorbent materials. Dining in public might be rare, with communal eating viewed as an extreme risk, leading to the rise of individually portioned, hermetically sealed meals. Food preparation would involve meticulous, almost obsessive sterilization, with home kitchens resembling sterile labs. Social greetings would be entirely non-contact, a bow, a slight nod, or a hand placed over the heart, replacing handshakes and embraces. Love and intimacy would navigate a treacherous landscape of fear and perceived risk. Perhaps courtship would involve long periods of health vetting or the exchange of personal health records before physical closeness was considered. Even shared air in a small room might feel like a gamble. The absence of antibiotics would not just affect individuals, it would reshape global power structures and economic priorities. Human capital as a precarious asset. With high mortality and shorter lifespans, the concept of human capital would be dramatically devalued and simultaneously fiercely protected. Labor shortages would be chronic, especially for physically demanding or high-risk jobs. This could accelerate automation in ways we can barely imagine, not out of efficiency, but out of necessity for survival, with robots performing tasks too dangerous for humans. Education systems would struggle, as a smaller percentage of the population survives to reach peak productivity, leading to a perpetual cycle of knowledge loss and rediscovery. Apprenticeships and long-term training would be high-risk investments. National security redefined. Military might would extend beyond weaponry to include a nation's capacity for public health. A country's ability to maintain a healthy, large standing army would depend on its sanitation infrastructure and its medical countermeasures. Biological warfare, though terrifying, might be a constant specter, but perhaps also a deterrent, knowing that a released pathogen could easily backfire on the aggressor with no effective treatment. Border control would be less about immigration and more about disease vector management, with strict health checks and quarantine protocols for all travelers. Reminiscent of medieval plague controls, but with 20th century technology. Trade routes would be constantly disrupted by outbreaks, leading to more self-sufficient, localized economies. Resource allocation and innovation drives. A disproportionate amount of national budgets would be diverted to public health, research into alternative treatments, and disease surveillance. This massive diversion of resources would inevitably slow down progress in other fields like space exploration, advanced computing, beyond what aids medical research, or consumer electronics. The primary driver of innovation would be survival, leading to a focused, almost monomaniacal pursuit of infection control and alternative therapies. Scientists would be the new rock stars, albeit ones working in highly dangerous, isolated environments. Global alliances and dependencies. Nations might form alliances based on shared health threats and scientific cooperation, rather than traditional economic or military interests. Countries with access to rare traditional remedies, advanced sterilization technologies, or unique phage strains might hold immense geopolitical leverage, effectively holding the key to survival for others. The international pharmaceutical industry, if it existed, would be entirely different, focused on vaccines, antiseptics, and perhaps highly specialized, niche treatments for very specific bacterial strains. A health NATO might emerge, focused on sharing disease intelligence and medical resources. The constant threat would deeply embed itself in the human psyche, changing art, philosophy, and our understanding of existence. The shadow of mortality. Death would be a more frequent and intimate companion. This could lead to a pervasive sense of fatalism, or, conversely, an intensified focus on living each moment to its fullest. Albeit within stringent safety protocols, funerary rites might become elaborate and frequent, a communal acknowledgement of constant loss, perhaps involving quick burials or cremations to prevent further spread. The concept of a long life would be defined by decades, not centuries. Every family would have its personal roster of those lost young. Art and literature as reflection. Artistic expression would undeniably reflect this world. Literature might feature grim survival narratives, focusing on characters battling chronic illness or navigating contaminated landscapes. Art could depict the beauty of sterile environments or the terror of microscopic foes, with abstract shapes representing unseen threats. Music might carry somber themes of loss and resilience, or perhaps be used as a form of communal comfort and shared humanity in times of crisis. Children's stories would teach hygiene lessons through fables and cautionary tales, where the villain isn't a wolf, but a dirty hand or an invisible germ. Folk songs might chronicle the heroism of sanitation workers or the tragedy of a local outbreak. The role of faith and spirituality. In the face of uncontrollable disease, faith might either flourish as people seek divine intervention or explanations for suffering, or it might wane if traditional prayers prove ineffective. New spiritual movements focused on purity, cleanliness, and the sanctity of the body might emerge, with rituals of purification becoming deeply ingrained in religious practices. Pilgrimages to holy, clean sites or miraculous spring waters might become common, replacing traditional healing shrines. Superstition, long dismissed, could make a powerful comeback, with talismans for health, specific purification rituals before major life events, and fear of tainted places or people. Shifting ethics and morality. How would society grapple with the hard choices? Triage would be a brutal reality in every hospital and disaster zone, forcing agonizing decisions about who receives scarce resources or experimental treatments. Would a stronger emphasis be placed on the collective good over individual liberty when it came to quarantine and public health mandates? The concept of individual responsibility for hygiene would be paramount, and negligence might be viewed as a grave social offense, even a crime, akin to reckless endangerment. The value of life itself might be simultaneously heightened as it's so fragile and diminished as it's so commonly lost. Euthanasia for the hopelessly ill, to prevent further spread and alleviate suffering, might become a tragic but accepted practice. This world would demand a constant reevaluation of what it means to be human, to care for one another, and to survive against overwhelming odds. Individual human experiences, living under the shadow. Let's step closer to the ground and imagine the lived experience of individuals in this altered world. Childhood as a perilous journey. A child's earliest memories would be dominated by rituals of cleanliness. Playdates would be carefully orchestrated, often supervised by adults obsessively monitoring distance and hand hygiene. Scrapes and cuts, an inevitable part of growing up, wouldn't be met with a kiss and a band-aid, but with immediate, thorough disinfection, followed by days of anxious observation for any sign of redness or swelling. Fevers, coughs, or unexplained fatigue would send parents into a spiral of terror, often leading to immediate isolation of the child within the home, or a desperate trip to an overcrowded fever clinic with little hope of cure. The simple joy of exploring the world freely would be replaced by constant warnings about unseen dangers. Children might grow up with a deep, visceral understanding of mortality from a very young age. Seeing siblings or playmates succumb to what we consider minor illnesses. Their games might even revolve around doctors and patients in sterile environments, or germs chasing clean survivors. The burden of parenthood. For parents, the anxiety would be suffocating. Every sniffle, every minor rash on their child would be a source of profound dread. They would become amateur epidemiologists, meticulously tracking interactions, sterilizing toys, and constantly monitoring their children's health. The decision to have children might become a far more conscious and agonizing one, knowing the immense risks involved. The number of children a family might attempt to raise would likely decrease, given the high likelihood of losing several. Grief would be a constant companion, etched into the faces of older generations. The dream of their children outliving them, so commonplace today, would be a fragile, often unfulfilled hope. Marriage and intimacy redefined. The act of physical intimacy would carry an inherent, deeply ingrained risk. Courtship might involve extended periods of careful health assessment, perhaps even the sharing of detailed medical histories before any physical closeness. Weddings might include elaborate purification rituals, and honeymoons would likely be isolated affairs to minimize exposure. The decision to start a family would be a profound act of courage, knowing the peril of childbirth and the fragility of infant life. Trust in this world would not just be emotional, it would be biological. Sharing a bed, A meal or even a breath with someone would be a testament to a deep, often fearful bond. Travel as an extreme expedition. International travel, if it existed beyond essential trade, would be an elite and perilous undertaking. Passengers would undergo rigorous health screenings, mandatory quarantines upon arrival and departure, and continuous health monitoring. The concept of tourism would be almost non-existent. Journeys would be dictated by necessity, trade, diplomacy, or the desperate search for a healthier climate or a rumored new treatment. Ports and airports would be fortress-like biosecurity zones, with strict protocols and constant surveillance, designed more to keep disease out than to facilitate movement. The act of mourning. Death would be omnipresent. Funeral rites would likely be swift and highly hygienic, possibly involving immediate cremation to prevent further spread of pathogens. Public gatherings for mourning might be replaced by smaller, more intimate family rituals or even remote commemorations. The cultural memory of the dead would be less about their long lives and achievements and more about the circumstances of their passing, a constant reminder of the unseen enemy. Cemeteries would be vast, ever-growing landscapes, their sheer size a testament to a humanity perpetually losing its young. The Global South's grim reality, an amplified tragedy. While the impact on developed nations would be devastating, the consequences for what we call the Global South would be catastrophically amplified. Exacerbated poverty and health disparities. Regions already struggling with poverty, limited infrastructure, and existing disease burdens would be utterly overwhelmed. A lack of clean water, sanitation, and access to what few advanced medical techniques exist, like complex phage therapies, would mean rampant, unchecked bacterial infections. The mortality rates would dwarf those in wealthier nations. The cycle of disease and underdevelopment. Without antibiotics, the cycle of disease would perpetually trap nations in underdevelopment. High child mortality would mean a diminished future workforce. Chronic illness would cripple productivity. Resources that could be used for education, infrastructure, or economic growth would be constantly diverted to futile attempts at disease control and palliative care. This world would likely see a widening, unbridgeable chasm between the clean nations, those with advanced public health and limited outbreaks, and the sick nations, fostering a new form of global inequality defined by vulnerability to pathogens. Failed aid and isolation. International aid, as we know it, would struggle immensely. Sending doctors or supplies to a region ravaged by a highly contagious bacterial infection would be a suicidal mission. Instead, aid might focus solely on fundamental sanitation projects, clean wells, waste treatment, basic hygiene education, and the distribution of traditional remedies or locally cultivated antimicrobial plants. Borders would tighten mercilessly, isolating sick regions to prevent global spread, leading to even greater suffering and despair. The rise of localized solutions or desperation. In isolated communities, there might be a greater reliance on traditional healers, herbal medicines, and indigenous knowledge of plants with antimicrobial properties. While some might offer limited relief, the vast majority would be ineffective against virulent bacterial strains. This could also lead to a resurgence of harsh, desperate measures, including the forced isolation or even banishment of the sick, simply as a means of community survival. In this deeply expanded alternate history, humanity exists in a perpetual state of heightened vigilance, a species forever bound by the relentless pressure of bacterial life. The triumphs of our modern civilization, from grand surgeries to global travel and widespread public gatherings, would be either impossible or profoundly reshaped by the constant, silent threat. It's a world where every breath carries a potential danger, and every minor cut could be the beginning of the end. It is a profound testament to the quiet, foundational miracle of antibiotics that our world is so vastly different and our lives so much longer and freer from the ancient terrors of disease.